Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Iris Mauss. She's professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research focuses on emotions and emotion regulation, with an emphasis on their links to psychological and physical health. And today we're going to talk about emotion regulation, and some other related things like reappraisal, emotion goals, and also the potential psychological effects of us focusing too much on happiness. So, Dr. Mauss, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, about emotion, what is emotion exactly? I mean, because I would imagine that in different scientific disciplines, people would approach emotion in at least slightly different ways. So, in your work, how do you approach it? And what is basically perhaps the role and the importance of emotion for our overall psychology, let's say?
You hit on in a very understated way. You hit on one of the biggest debates in the field, actually.
Mm.
And so saying that there's slightly different approaches is a little bit of an understatement. But so the simple answer to your question, what is an emotion, is that I define emotions as responses that are valuative in nature, so have a good versus bad component, that are in response to internal or external stimuli.
Yeah.
And I consider emotions as involving the whole human. So there's experiences, behaviors, and physiological aspects to an emotional response that tend to be at least loosely coupled with one another. So that's how I think of emotions. As I alluded to, there's big divergences across researchers about exactly the nature of emotional response. And the nature of how the various emotional components relate to one another. But I find this a good starting point. Yeah.
And so, about the second part of my question, when it comes to our overall psychology, what would you say is the importance of emotions? What is the role that emotions play there? And particularly, since we're going to focus a lot on psychological and physical health, I mean, basically, how important are emotions in that regard?
Yeah, so I think emotions are absolutely essential to all aspects of health, psychological, physical health.
Mhm.
And really, if we think about emotions, they're so integral to all aspects of human functioning and human psychology. I sometimes sort of in my courses challenge students to think of any time when they experience no emotion at all. And so obviously we can think of times when we're not very emotional, but I think that it's hard to think of times when we have absolutely no emotion at all. And then, of course, many of life's biggest and most consequential events are characterized by an abundance, sometimes overabundance of rich emotional experiences. So, in a way, I think emotions are absolutely integral to psychological and physical health and all of human psychology. And it's interesting, actually, that in a way, psychology has little bit ignored emotion more so than other aspects of psychology. So cognition has been in the field topic of research for longer in modern empirical psychology. Here comes the cat. And we can talk about maybe why that is.
Mhm.
but it has changed. So in the last 10, 20 years, emotions have very much so become a topic of research interest, appropriately so. And there's been a recent paper even that has sort of described what they call the rise of affectivism in psychology.
Which is actually very interesting because, I mean, at least by now, isn't it? I mean, I perhaps consensual is too strong a word to use here, to use here. Sorry, but isn't it the case that by now we've already sort of established that there's no strict division between emotion and cognition, or emotion and reason, because we actually need emotion to even be able to reason, right?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think there's kind of two really interesting parts to that statement.
Okay.
One way is that I think, and that's maybe the simpler way to think about that distinction between cognition and emotion, and
Mm,
that's the idea that they mutually constitute one another.
mm,
So, in other words, how we think directly shapes how we feel, and how we feel directly shapes how we think. So there's a mutual interdependence, if you will, and they're very much so intertwined.
yeah.
But in that way of thinking, we can still distinguish between more cognitive and more emotional processes.
Okay.
But there's a second way that's less straightforward of thinking about that distinction, and that basically sort of says you basically want to do away with the distinction, such that responses that we call emotional in nature really generalize processes that we sometimes call cognitive, and apply them to how humans respond. And so, for example, Lisa Feldman Barrett is a researcher who I think has advanced a model that's more aligned with that way of thinking,
Yeah.
whereby basically general processes constitute both emotional and cognitive responses. In my research, I still find it useful to make the and maintain a distinction, at least in principle, between more cognitive appraisal processes thinking versus more emotional processes. And yeah, I find it helpful. And also, I think there's some grounding in empirical science to distinguish those types of processes, even
Mm.
if we say that they're very much so intertwined with one another.
Okay. And why do you think that, at least historically, people have focused more on cognition than emotion?
Um, That's a great question. I'm not a historian of science, but I think there's one answer to that question is just that it has been incredibly difficult to do empirical science on emotions. And so I think, quite frankly, researchers were unsure about how we could even study these very ephemeral processes of the mind, and sort of simply were hesitant to do so until I think William James was sort of an early precursor on sort of at least talking in a principled and at least in principle, empirically accessible way about feelings and emotions. And then, of course, Sylvan Tompkins and Paul Ekman, starting in the 50s and the 60s, 1950s, 1960s,
Yeah.
put emotion science out on the map. They were the first ones to really start conducting empirical work as we understand it today on emotions. And that, I think, started a little bit of it sort of opened the floodgates, I
Yeah.
think, because they were the ones to sort of step up. And of course, their work drew a lot of criticism, but I think it was really important to just show that you have to get started somewhere, even if it's a really simplified first approach. And sort of that, I think, really catalyzed the field into starting somewhere and then going from there. And today we ended up with just an immensely rich body of research. Yeah.
And
That's
I mean, yeah, I'm not sure if this has played a big role or not, but I would imagine that also, at least in our Western tradition, I mean, people have been looking down for a long time on emotions. I mean, it's basically about reason and about being reasonable and about taming your emotions and ideally eliminating them because, I mean, apparently people thought that if you could do that, you would reason even better, even though we now know that you can't even reason without emotions. But anyway, at least there's some legacy of that kind of thinking about emotions, I guess.
Yeah. And that very much so reappears in the research today. And I'm sure we'll talk about that
Mhm.
later. But that distinction between reason and emotion, of course,
Yeah,
goes back a long time. There's the Platonic ideas about
yeah.
sort of human passions,
Mhm.
hijacking human reason. And ideally, we should be guided by mostly reason and not so much the passions. Of course, there's an Aristotelian view that's different from that, and that doesn't sort of see emotions as just negative, harmful, animal-like, but rather thinks about emotions, I think, in a much more in a way that's much more aligned with modern thinking about emotions. And so Aristotle proposed something that's more aligned to sort of like feeling the right amount of an emotion in the right way and to the right extent as being conducive to the good life. So it's a view of emotions that's not so starkly negative, animal-like, and rather like we do have to modulate emotions as the view, but we can still use them, and they're very important for uh, for making decisions and conducting our life in a way that's virtuous and a good life. And that view reappeared, of course, in various different shapes and forms. So Hume, for example, arguing that reason is and ought to be the servant of the passions. And so there's another sort of historical view of emotions as really integral to making good decisions. But I think your starting point is really well taken, that at the early part of the 20th century, there was a really negative view that was in part sort of like Freudian psychoanalytic, right? That saw emotions as the source of many of the most horrible things about humans: aggression, destructive impulses, the id basically being the seat of emotions. And I think actually you're absolutely right that that sort of fed into hesitance to study these bad things. And
Yeah.
when people studied them, they studied them as something to be controlled and how we sort of can get rid of them. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting observation. Can I make one more point about this?
Oh, yes, of course.
And one of the most, I think it's like just the fascinating observation, sort of like how people think at the most fundamental level about emotions. Like, are emotions good or are they bad? And we've actually started to study how lay people think about emotions, sort of like akin to these philosophical debates. Most lay people have intuitions about emotions that are sort of like either of the sort of Platonic flavor, where they think, no, emotions are to be feared and controlled. These are bad things that I should get rid of.
Mhm.
But then some people, lay people, not philosophers, have sort of the more Aristotelian, Hume-like intuitions about emotions, where they think emotions are to be embraced, they're
Yeah.
important in our lives, and give our lives meaning and richness. And that extends to unpleasant emotions. Yeah, so there's a really interesting parallel to that philosophical debate in how lay people think about emotions.
So when it comes to classifying emotions in terms of them being good or bad, we're talking about valence here, right? That's usually the term that psychologists use, or not?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. And I would say no.
Mm,
And I should check my own. I think there's a habit of doing that, and I
okay.
myself have that habit, and I should check myself because um, we can. So one of the most basic ways in which we differentiate among different emotions is
Yeah.
by valence. And there's emotions that feel good,
Mhm.
pleasant, like joy, hope, love, excitement, peace, calm. And there's emotions that feel unpleasant, anger, sadness, despair, fear, and so forth. And sometimes we jump to the conclusion that pleasant emotions are those that are good
Okay.
and those that we should strive for. And we assume that all people want to feel pleasant emotions. And conversely, unpleasant emotions are those that are bad, that people want to avoid, and that are harmful. But it turns out that that mapping doesn't isn't completely accurate with regard to what emotions people want to feel and also what emotions people should want to feel. Maya Tamir, who's a psychologist at the Hebrew University, has studied the cases really in depth where the exact opposite is true. And sometimes those are the most interesting cases where people pursue what's called contrahedonic emotions. My cat is especially active. He loves the topic. Basically, sometimes, more than sometimes, people pursue unpleasant emotions and avoid pleasant emotions. And that can be quite adaptive in people's lives.
Okay, but when it comes to pursuing unpleasant emotions, do we know if in those particular cases or contexts people still experience them as unpleasant or not?
That's really so you mean when people pursue unpleasant
Mhm.
emotions,
Yeah.
um, are they still truly unpleasant?
Mhm.
Or does it kind of then feel good? Like let's say,
Or perhaps if we would ask people in those particular contexts whether they thought they had experienced a positive or negative or a good or bad emotion, they wouldn't say it was bad, even though
Yes.
it wasn't pleasant. I mean, it's a bit confusing perhaps, but yeah, that's what I'm asking.
It's a great question, and many psychologists ask that too. And so I think there's sort of two parts to this. One part is that we need to distinguish the phenomenology of the emotion, what it
Mm-hmm.
feels like,
Yeah.
from its consequences
Okay.
for my functioning, for my health, and so forth. So, um, and so when I say pleasant, unpleasant, I'm just referring to what it feels like. And so Maya Tamir's and others' research has established that unpleasant emotions can have benefits. And so we might call them good for something else. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, in research with Brett Ford, they've shown that when people are about to sort of head into a contentious negotiation, they tend to favor feeling anger over other emotions, anger being generally an emotion that's experienced as unpleasant. And they do so because anger has these functional benefits in their lives. It makes them slightly more energetic, effective negotiators. And so that's sometimes what we mean by good when we talk about emotions. So that said, so that's sort of like a simpler way of answering your question, right? That we have to distinguish the various purposes that emotions serve to talk about pleasant, unpleasant, good, bad. And emotions serve hedonic purposes in people's lives. Generally, people want to feel pleasant, want not to feel unpleasant. But emotions also serve a bunch of other purposes that we could call instrumental purposes. Emotions can also make us fit in or not fit in with our culture and other people. That's independent of the valence dimension. Emotions can also help us achieve performance goal, like the negotiation context that I just mentioned. And that's also independent of the hedonic or
Mm-hmm.
feeling or valence dimension. Now, there's sort of like, and there we get maybe a tiny little bit more into the weeds. Once you say that emotions, independent of their valence, can serve these other purposes, it's entirely possible that then there's a feedback loop such that emotions truly don't just simply feel pleasant or unpleasant, because in realizing my anger serves a purpose in my life, I might come to experience it as less aversive, less unpleasant. I sort of relish my anger almost. And then we get into sort of states that are mixed feeling states. And we encounter those like really interesting emotional states when we think about righteous moral outrage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where probably that has an unpleasant element to it, but also an element of pleasant, well, feeling righteous. So um, that's sort of like one answer to your really interesting question, that sort of this very basic valence dimension isn't quite so basic when we take a closer look. And wanting or feeling pleasant is not quite such a simple pursuit. And in fact, it's not what most humans do exclusively most of the time.
Yeah, actually, when you mentioned when how people sometimes want to feel angry in the context of negotiation. I mean, it came to my mind another context where I've heard many people saying that they want to feel angry. That is, for example, in a competition context, like, for example, in sports or particularly combat sports. I've heard many people saying that when, for example, in MMA, wrestling, and so on, when they are going out into the ring, they really want to feel angry. They don't want to feel good. They want to feel angry and tense and all of that because that's what drives them to really uh, fight, I guess.
I think that's a great example that I've heard a lot as well. And similarly, some people want to, at some level, I use the term broadly,
Yeah.
worry, feel some anxiety. It serves a purpose in their lives. Some people want to, and again, I use the term broadly, feel sadness.
Mhm.
And so, absolutely.
And so, to get into another topic, but also a related one, what is emotion regulation?
Um, Another actually really complicated question that sort of there's a lot of division in the field about. I like, again, a pretty simple definition of emotion regulation as altering your emotions in accordance with a goal that can be implicit or explicit.
So, I mean, do you think that in the sort of cases and contexts we were just mentioning, that would count as an example? Do you think that people do emotion regulation in those cases or not?
In the cases where they sort of
Where
are,
they are basically competing,
uh-huh.
negotiating, stuff like that.
Yes, I think so. And it sort of like we're heading into right away, sort of like one of the areas that has made it difficult to draw the line between what is emotion,
Mhm.
reactivity,
Yeah.
versus what is regulation of emotion.
Mhm.
Because, say, your mixed martial arts wrestler might sort of pump themselves up, feel sort of induce some level of anger, but probably if you ask them, they don't necessarily say, oh, I'm going to regulate my emotions so that I feel a little bit more anger so that I can whoop my adversary's ass a little bit better. Um, but I still think so. It heads into a really interesting sort of gray zone where emotion regulation, and that's why I included the implicit goal idea, where emotion regulation is automatic or to some degree unconscious. So people are not necessarily aware that there's a goal activated to regulate emotions. Um, and then you could ask, well, how do we know that someone is regulating or simply um, emotional in a particular way
Mhm.
without any goal to alter their emotions? And I think one answer is I think we don't know. We don't yet have really convincing measures of these implicit, unconscious ways of regulating, altering our emotions according with implicit goals. But we have a little bit of understanding that, and at least in principle, the distinction again is a useful one between emotion reactivity that people differ on without the activation of a particular goal to alter the emotional response.
But if it's done implicitly, if it's sort of subconscious, um, how do you know that people are doing it? I mean, it
Yes.
must be hard, right?
Yes. So it's incredibly difficult to, and that's why I said I don't think we have very good evidence base for knowing that people have actually engaged in unconscious or implicit emotion regulation.
Yeah.
What we do know is that one, unconscious processes, including goal-based processes, play a really important role in psychology in general. What we also know is that some of the most interesting individual differences and group differences in emotion regulation seem to at least partly play out on an implicit, not always consciously accessible level. So just for example, there's socialization processes that sort of inculcate or teach children that they can or can't regulate their emotions. Sometimes we call that implicit models of emotion.
Could you give us an example of that, please?
Yeah, so emotions can be seen as either something that's controllable, that's not super dangerous, that I can do something about. And we would ask about this kind of, you could call it an implicit model or a mindset by
Mhm.
asking people very straightforward, are emotions controllable in general? Can humans do something about the emotions that they have? And that's sometimes also a controllability or malleability mindset is the term. The other end of the spectrum is what's sometimes called a fixed mindset or entity mindset. And that's basically the idea that emotions are very difficult to control, that they are overwhelming forces. So the reason why I brought that up as an example of implicit emotion regulation or a process that feeds into implicit emotion regulation is that I think people in general are not always aware of the beliefs that they have about emotions in that way. Um, and yet those beliefs have very important consequences for whether and how we regulate our emotions.
So do these beliefs, this kind that, of course, as you mentioned, there can stem from the way we are socialized, do they play a role in the degree to which we are able to regulate our emotions?
Yes. So, and that's why they came up as one really important aspect of implicit or unconscious processes in emotion regulation.
Mhm.
And there's two sort of really fundamental beliefs about emotions that play a role here. One is, are emotions good or bad? And we already talked about that a little bit earlier, right? And it sort of translates to the belief, should people control their emotions or should they not?
Uh-huh.
Should they control, that's sort of like the Platonic view, if you will. Should they not? Should they be guided by their emotions? That's more the Hume view.
Yeah.
That's one really basic distinction. The other really basic belief is, can people control their emotions or can they not? With the first being sort of the view that emotions are not so dangerous, that they don't necessarily overwhelm us. And the second view being that emotions are these dangerous, overwhelming forces that I can't necessarily control, or that people can't necessarily control. So the second belief is the one that seems to have really important implications for people's ability to regulate their emotions. And it makes perfect sense, because if you think about it for a moment, if you don't believe that emotions are controllable, you're not even going to try to regulate them. So, and that has been borne out in the research, such that in general, people with more controllability beliefs, people who believe that emotions can be controlled, tend to engage in more adaptive, more effective emotion regulation.
And so, apart from these sort of emotion regulation related beliefs, what are some of the other factors that explain both individual and group differences in emotion regulation?
So beliefs are a really important factor here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a bunch of other factors that I think play a role, that have to do with how people judge and think about their emotions in general. So, and a lot of it has to do with socialization processes.
Yeah.
So, for example, when we think about should emotions be controlled, culture seems to play an important role in sort of setting up that particular belief about emotions and downstream consequences for emotion regulation. So two cultures that have been kind of often contrasted with one another are East Asian, more interdependent cultures, and European or European American, more independent cultures. And generally, as a function of these differences in self-construals and beliefs about the nature of the self and what is the role that individuals should play in social context, people differ with regard to how they think, or the extent to which they think emotions should be regulated, and then emotion regulation. So there's a pretty stable pattern such that East Asian interdependent cultures tend to endorse emotion suppression more so than Western independent cultures.
And do the benefits that we get from emotion regulation depend on the context? I mean, are there perhaps contexts where uh, trying to regulate your emotions more might actually not be beneficial or not?
Yeah. So it's a super fascinating question. And I think we want to back up for a moment and think
Okay.
a little bit more about what emotion regulation is and make a couple of distinctions that I think are really important when we answer that question. So emotion regulation is not sort of like one monolith, but people can go about regulating their emotions in several different ways. And one of the sort of like core models that the field uses to distinguish various types of emotion regulation is based on James Gross's process model of emotion regulation. And the model is actually a pretty simple and really useful one. And basically, idea is when people have an emotion, you sort of go through a process. You encounter a situation, you pay attention to the situation, you appraise the situation in a particular way, And then you respond with your experience, physiology, and behavior to that situation. So that's the process of emotion. Now, to regulate that emotion, you can intervene or alter each of those four steps. So let's say somebody is anxious about giving a public speech or something. So they can change that emotion by intervening at four different points. First, they can change the situation. They can say, I'm going to cancel this speech. And voila, no emotion. Second, they can say, I'm going to change what I pay attention to. I could choose to pay attention to the friendly person who's sitting in the front rather than the scowling, skeptical people who are sitting at other places in the audience. So that's sort of altering my attention. And again, it'll change my emotion. Third, I can change my appraisal of the situation. So, for example, I could tell myself that this is sort of one event. If I think about sort of like the history or the arc of my life or the whole universe, this is just like the teensiest blip. And that might do away with a lot of anxiety. And then, so that's appraisal change, sometimes called reappraisal. And then fourth, we can change the emotional responses. And so um, focusing for a moment on the response of anxious behavior, I could just try to tamp down on that behavior and keep sort of like a non-anxious neutral face rather than showing that I'm sort of terrified on the inside. So that's sort of like four groups of emotional regulation that people often distinguish. So now, and I needed to make that distinction because before answering your question about whether emotion regulation is kind of moderated or whether emotion regulation's effects on health and well-being are moderated by the context. Because to answer that question, we first need to understand the effects of emotion regulation on well-being in general. And then we can understand whether there are boundary conditions or context moderation. So backing up. So I backed up 2 steps. Now I'm backing up 1 step. And sort of like we'll give you like the super simplified answer, which is that in general, when people kind of studied emotion regulation, there's a lot of research that has focused on reappraisal, changing our appraisals or construals of emotional situations, and expressive suppression, just tamping down on the emotions that I show in my behavior. And the first lines of research very generally indicated that people who use reappraisal, especially people who use reappraisal very effectively, tend to do better. They have greater well-being. They have better social relationships. There's even hints that they have better physical health in some like certain domains. In contrast, people who tend to use expressive suppression, they feel something on the inside, but they don't show it on the outside, tend to be less psychologically healthy and have less good social relationships. So 2 really important domains of well-being and functioning. And then again, sort of hints that even physical health might be negatively impacted. So that was sort of like the first line of findings in emotion regulation research. now I come to your question that is, well, are there context effects? Are those sort of simple relationships always and necessarily true? Is it the case that reappraisal is good for everybody to use and in all contexts? Is it the case that suppression is bad for everybody to use and in all contexts? And as you can imagine, like for most things in life, no, they're not all good or all bad. So there's in fact really interesting boundary conditions and moderators. And so one interesting, or I want to give you two examples for moderators, one for reappraisal and one for suppression, just to keep things symmetrical. So reappraisal has been shown, like I said, to be beneficial in lots of different contexts for lots of different people. And actually, reappraisal is one of the most, I think, culturally and across people stable effects that I've seen. So I love cultural differences and sort of have looked or always interested in sort of looking at how things might play out differently in different cultures. And I want to preface sort of what I say about boundary conditions by saying that I've been actually really struck by how stable these benefits of reappraisal appear to be. So recent research in my lab, for example, looked at reappraisal in Mexican American adolescents, and it was good across time for anhedonia symptoms. With Qing Zhao, we've looked at Chinese American immigrants, and again, adolescents found reappraisal was good for them. And that sort of dovetails with a lot of other research. But one particular context where we and others have found that reappraisal seems to hit some limits is when we look in particular types of situational adversity, and in particular, more when people face more controllable stress. So the idea is that sometimes it can be really good to regulate your own emotions, make yourself feel better, feel less negative and more positive emotions. And that's what reappraisal is really effective at. But sometimes, and this goes back to something that we talked about earlier, it might not be the best idea to tinker with your own emotions. But rather, sometimes it might be a better idea to actually alter the situation that you're in. And that's the case when you're facing a controllable stressor or controllable adversity. Let's say you're in a fight with your best friend. Should you then tell yourself, oh, it's just a blip in time, it's not as bad as it looks, I'm gonna feel better? Or should you feel some of that sadness or anger or worry and use those unpleasant emotions in turn to fuel a motivation? Hash it out with your friend, apologize to your friend, and so forth. And so the argument is that when you face controllable adversity, things that you can and maybe should do something about, it might be better to not self-regulate using reappraisal. And so few different studies have indicated that that's indeed the case. So found that people who were in more controllable, who had experienced more controllable life stress in the past 18 months previous to assessment, the better they were at emotion regulation, the more depressed they actually felt. People who are in uncontrollable life stress, the better they were at emotion regulation via reappraisal, the less depression they felt. So you see almost like this teeter-totter of self-regulation versus situation regulation. Another study that Brett Ford and Oliver John and Phoebe Lamb headed found that Clinton voters, after the 2016 presidential election, where Donald Trump won and Hillary Clinton lost, when they used reappraisal as assessed with surveys or by experimental manipulation, when they used reappraisal and effectively reduced their negative emotions, they were actually less likely to then go out and protest or try to do something about the situation that was very stressful for them as Clinton voters. And that again hints at that teeter-totter of self-regulation that might sometimes come at the cost of situation regulation and doing something about bad situations.
Mm-hmm.
So
mean,
that was a long answer to your question about reappraisal, and it can sometimes be bad. We can stop there, or I can tell you about when suppression might be not so bad.
Okay, but just before we get into that, I mean, one example was coming to my mind while you were explaining all of that. Hopefully, it's a good example. I'm not sure, but I mean, perhaps a case, perhaps there's a particular kind of case where, I mean, doing emotion regulation would not be so good. So, for example, if you are a man who was brought up in a with very strict masculine norms, and for example, you associate stoicism with being very masculine, and for example, you experience a loss, a family member of yours die, and then you are at the funeral and you just try to suppress or regulate some of your emotion, and you avoid crying because I mean, crying is not manly or something like that. I mean, perhaps that would be something that would have potentially negative psychological consequences. I mean, I'm not sure if the example is the best one, but what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's a great example. And first off, you hit on a really important gender difference in expressive suppression, where
Yeah.
men across various cultures and groups that have been studied tend to say they use expressive suppression more than women. And so that's a gender stereotype that we have, and that seems to be borne out in socialization
Yeah.
in how and degrees to which men versus women use expressive suppression. And it's a great example because in general, expressive suppression has been associated with bad outcomes. Like I said earlier, like in terms of psychological health and social functioning. And that seems to be true across the genders and across a number of different groups. That said, your example actually is a great one in hinting at potentially a boundary condition to the harms of expressive suppression. And that's that stems from the idea that there's sort of two reasons why expressive suppression might be bad. One is that sort of like it's, and you could think of it as inherent to the suppression. I have an emotional impulse, and in sort of like almost like a Freudian way, I tamp down on it, and that sort of like makes the impulse grow stronger and more harmful, hydraulically almost. And there's some physiological measures that are consistent with that. But also, suppression might be bad for a second reason that's not sort of inherent to the process, but has to do with how people think about the process. And some people think that suppression is actually the culturally appropriate and correct thing to do. So in sort of coming back to the distinction of independent and interdependent cultures, in independent cultures, we think of emotions sort of as something that we ought to express. It's part of being authentic, part of the norm. If you're sad and you are grieving, you can cry even if you're a man. But in other cultures, emotions are not seen as so acceptable. I mentioned that earlier, sort of the interdependent view of emotions as something that can upset social harmony, and individual emotions ought to sometimes at least be adjusted to the context. And so if we think of emotions in that way, expressive suppression might be more valued in a cultural context, specifically in interdependent cultures. And so there's some indication that accordingly, we then see that expressive suppression in those cultural contexts is not quite as harmful and sometimes even beneficial. Going back to the study I mentioned earlier that was led by Gerald Young, he looked at expressive suppression in Mexican American adolescents and its relationship with depressive symptoms. And he argued that actually in the Mexican American cultural context, positive emotionality is highly valued. It's sort of like the ethos of simpatia, if you will. But negative emotions are very much so not valued. And consistent with the idea that the effects of expressive suppression depend on the cultural view of expressive suppression, he found that suppression of positive emotions was linked with greater depressive symptoms, but suppression of negative emotions was actually linked with lower depressive symptoms in this sample, indicating that there are really important moderators. Not the case that it's always bad or always good. So in the broadest sense, we come back to the takeaway that no single emotion regulation strategy is always good or always bad, but it depends on the context.
So I think that perhaps we could say here that at least one underlying or current theme here has to do with culture and cultural context. We've talked here, for example, about differences between independent and interdependent cultures. So, for example, the differences between Western cultures and East Asian cultures. So, I mean, isn't it the case that when it comes to, for example, understanding mental health, that perhaps even when it comes to the mental health professionals themselves, that perhaps they have to take into account the cultural context where the patients come from? Because it seems at least very obvious to me that this would have clinical implications or not?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's one of the really important implications here that and we want to, I think, construe culture broadly.
Yeah.
You know, we focused a little bit on interdependence, independence, East, West, but of course, ethnicity is a really important driver of values, beliefs, particular ecologies that people live in, types of adversity that they face. Gender is another way of thinking about culture. And so culture broadly construed absolutely is really important for the implications and thinking about this for mental health and interventions, and helping people use emotional regulation to serve them in their lives. Absolutely.
And that, do you think that among those different aspects or factors that you mentioned there, like ethnicity, gender, would you also list among them socioeconomic status or not?
Yes, yeah, I think so. In that socioeconomic status, of course, is deeply intertwined with ethnicity, race, gender, and so forth. And also in that it constitutes a ecology, if you will. What kinds of values and beliefs will people encounter in their environments? What kinds of adversity, what levels of adversity will they encounter, and so forth. So we talked about controllability of adversity as one of the factors that moderates the effects of reappraisal, right? How effective emotional regulation via reappraisal tends to not be as beneficial when people can and should do something about situations that they're in. And so one extension of this is to say, well, let's look at SES as a factor that's related to controllability, right? The more resources people have, the higher in SES they have, the more control over their environment they tend to have. By extension, then, reappraisal should be less beneficial for people higher versus lower in SES. And we tested that idea in 3 different samples together with Alison Troy and Kateri McRae, and found evidence that that's the case. So people lower in SES tended to benefit more from reappraisal. And that might be due to the fact that lower SES co-varies with having less control over the context. And therefore, and I say that a little bit with some pain, because I think there might be a cost to the person in some other ways. But at least when we look at mental health, there's a benefit to self-regulating.
Mm-hmm. And so, are there ways of improving our emotion regulation? I mean, anything that we can do individually to improve how we regulate our emotions, or the extent to which we are able to do it?
Yes. First, there's, good old therapy. And so, cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the ways that very much so helps people recognize when and why they use maybe dysfunctional types of emotional regulation. That teaches them how to and what kinds of regulation they might use that might benefit them in their lives,
Yeah.
and also teaches techniques. In essence, restructuring automatic thoughts is a way of teaching people to use reappraisal. So that's one really important piece. I want to also talk about more recent extensions of CBT that incorporate mindfulness and acceptance into the therapy. And those, I think, are sort of like a spin on CBT that sort of are very relevant to emotion regulation. But they make a really interesting extension by, at their core, relying on emotional acceptance.
By the way, when you mention acceptance there, are you tying it to acceptance and commitment therapy or not?
Yes.
Or does, oh, okay, okay.
Yes. So it's acceptance and commitment therapy as sort of like one of those recent, I mean, there's divergent opinions, I think, on whether they are cognitive or like a completely new thing. But regardless, there's sort of mindfulness-based cognitive therapies, but also acceptance and commitment therapy that all sort of incorporate themes of mindfulness and emotional acceptance into the therapy. And why am I talking about those when answering your question about how people can improve emotion regulation? Because at first glance, you might think, well, this is emotional acceptance, accepting your emotions as they are.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like the exact opposite of emotion regulation, right? And so to me, these are incredibly interesting extensions, and they bring into the fold of emotion regulation, emotional acceptance. And so in the last, I don't know, like 10, 15 years, the emotion regulation field, I think, has started to grapple with what is emotional acceptance? How does that play into emotion regulation? Does it undermine the whole idea that emotion regulation or reappraisal is such a great thing? Because we do know that emotional acceptance has benefits. And so that sort of like could be seen as an issue, right? Emotion regulation researchers over here talking about how you should regulate your emotions. And then people over there who say, oh, just accept your emotions and sort of magically that will improve your well-being. So to me, it's really interesting to think about why emotional acceptance could be beneficial and how it relates to emotion regulation. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about acceptance in a moment. I want to sort of just briefly answer your question about how people can improve their emotion regulation in one more way, because sort of not everybody has the capacity to go to therapy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really expensive. You have to have access to a therapist. And so there's, I think, recent developments in mobile assisted interventions, even apps that deliver often it's sort of couched in sort of mindfulness interventions that deliver interventions in a much more accessible manner that can help people regulate their emotions better. There was a recent study by David Yeager and colleagues that delivered a 30-minute, what they called synergistic mindset intervention that was based on the idea that basically if you change people's beliefs about emotions, that's sort of a really effective way to help them regulate their emotions better. And so they basically taught people two things. First, emotions and your own mind is controllable. So it goes back to that controllability belief. And second, emotions aren't these, like, including stress, aren't these super dangerous, terrible things. And so they call that a synergistic mindset because you needed to teach both of those. And they found that's a 30-minute intervention, and they found a bunch of benefits associated with that that was mediated by emotion regulation. So that's a couple of thoughts on how people can be helped and taught to regulate their emotions in better ways. Somehow we got into acceptance, which I think is really important. Maybe we can talk about it, but I don't know whether you want to talk about acceptance.
Yeah, no, actually, I was going to just comment briefly on it. If I say something wrong here, please correct me. But actually, I mean, when it comes to mindfulness specifically, and that idea coming from, for example, Zen Buddhism that people apply to mindfulness, where they teach you that it doesn't really matter much what goes on in your mind, the sort of thoughts that your mind produces, the sort of feelings, because that's just something that happens. You have really no control over, but how you react to it and what you do with it, it's something that you can control, not the thoughts, but what you do about them. Actually, for me, I mean, when you tie it to accepting what goes around in your mind, is a sort of, I always tied it to a sort of emotion regulation or control, because it's actually about you uh, being able over time to react how you want to your own feelings, your own thoughts, and so on. So I mean, at least for me personally, there doesn't seem to be, even though the word there is acceptance,
Mhm.
there doesn't seem to be much contradiction there. But I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
So, yeah, I think that's exactly one way in which emotion regulation researchers have reconciled this sort of like apparent or seeming tension that
Mhm.
basically they've said, well, it's kind of like a type of reappraisal of your own emotional response. Maybe that's what you mean, right?
Mhm.
Um, because sort of acceptance sort of is at the level of the initial emotional response, I think. And you sort of, rather than thinking about that response as something that's um, important, right,
Mhm.
to to regulate and tinker with, you simply let it be. You don't judge it. You maybe mindfully observe it with curiosity, but you don't try to sort of tinker with that initial emotional response or the feeling state. You very much so, and acceptance seems to empower people to do that. You very much so decide how you want to respond to it, sort of the downstream actions, right?
Mhm.
I feel angry. Am I going to hit somebody? No. And so some people have argued that like it's a type of reappraisal of your own emotions, if you will. I'm not sure that that's actually completely right
Mm.
because it really emotional acceptance really is encountering your emotions without judgment, without um, trying to alter them. I truly let them be. It like you said, it's I don't give them a lot of importance, but I also don't try to alter them. So I do think emotional acceptance is different from reappraisal
Okay.
in that way. Um, I do think to me, it's more about sort of once you have an experience to let it be. I absolutely agree, and there seems to be like a positive relationship between acceptance and precisely not having the space not to act on your emotions. But to me, acceptance seems more about like it's the like the inverse of experiential avoidance. You allow the experience, but also you're not afraid of it because you don't see it as defining yourself as being identical with yourself. So to me, acceptance and reappraisal actually play a really interesting synergistic role and sort of seem to live alongside one another rather than being one and the same
Mhm.
process.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was just pointing to the fact that perhaps what seems initially to be a sort of contradiction there
Mhm.
between emotion regulation and acceptance, perhaps it's not such a big contradiction, I mean,
Yes,
that's
I
more or less
agree.
what I was saying, not necessarily equating acceptance to reappraisal. So,
Yes, okay, yes. I think we have the exact same response then. Yeah, yeah.
okay,
But we
so
don't know yet a lot
yeah.
about acceptance. Like it's been like a little ignored by emotion regulation
Mhm.
researchers for a while. And so I think it's a very there's starting to be more and more research from the emotion regulation field
Mhm.
on it. And I think that's a really interesting development because we've talked a lot about reappraisal. Truth be told, reappraisal is a pretty complicated, abstract process. I don't know whether that's a reaction you have. You're like talking about thinking about your emotional situation in a way that sort of changes it. That's
Yeah.
a little bit abstract and complicated. And what I like about acceptance is that, at least in theory, it's more straightforward. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is all very complicated. Don't get me wrong. When I talk about mindfulness to this day, I'm not sure that I 100% understand what's that thing about just letting your thoughts pop into your head and not doing anything about it. I mean, it's a bit weird as well. So,
It's true too, actually. And that's why I quickly added like in theory, it's more
yeah, yeah,
straightforward because you're right. I mean, that's why you have like meditation courses that are many, many weeks and hours and days long. And like it sounds so straightforward, just let your emotions naturally unfold. Think of them like clouds in the sky and so forth. But when we do experimental studies, somehow it's actually not easy at all to actually do this for our participants. And no matter what metaphors we use, it's tricky. And I've wondered a lot about why that is. I mean, one idea, of course, is that we're so used to thinking about our emotions. This goes back all the way to something that you said much earlier. We're very much so used to think about our emotions as dangerous, potentially overwhelming, negative things that we quickly should do something about, lest they overwhelm us. And so maybe acceptance is such a difficult thing because it goes against those beliefs.
Mm-hmm. So, to get into the last topic of our conversation today, let's talk a little bit about happiness here, because I mean, this is you're not the first person that I talk with about this, but it seems that there are some paradoxical effects when it comes to valuing and seeking happiness, right?
Yes, happiness, one of my favorite topics. And of course, it's deeply intertwined with everything that we talked about. Happiness, of course, has, like is an emotional state, at least to some degree, right? Happiness has been studied as subjective well-being made of, in large part, like there's an evaluative, more cognitive piece to it, satisfaction with life, but then abundance of positive feelings and not so much negative feelings. Hedonic balance, sometimes it's called. It's inherently related to everything that we've been talking about. And um, you mentioned the paradoxical effects of valuing happiness. And I first became sort of interested in this sort of as a immigrant to the US, coming from Germany. I noticed that uh, in the US, happiness, of course, is colloquially and sort of in general talked about much more, right? We've all heard sort of like the stereotype of people asking, how's life in the US? And people will be, it's great. And sort of like when you first move from Northwestern Europe, it's sort of like, ooh, what really? So there's a cultural difference that kind of motivated me to look at how that value might play out in helping or hindering people from obtaining happiness. And so we've actually just finished a big paper together with Felicia Zerwis and Brett Ford and Oliver John that looked at this value across 5 different larger samples. So the idea is that in general, people value happiness. There's some cultural differences, but that's an overwhelming value around the world. And it like makes perfect sense, right? Because happiness feels good, as we talked about earlier, and it also helps people have better lives. Like it helps people be more successful. It contributes to greater mental health, greater social well-being, and so forth. And I also want to say that there's, of course, lots of interventions, social, psychological, and others that we already talked about that basically are based on the notion that helping people become happier is a good thing and it works. So Sonia Lubomirsky, of course, has amazing research on that, Barbara Fredrickson and others. At the same time, we had a sneaking suspicion that you could overdo it or do it in the wrong way. The idea being that if you are sort of singularly focused on being happy, becoming happier, there's a paradox in there where if we're focused on, say, doing better in math, you work hard, you set up an expectation, I'm going to do better, and you might not do as well as your expectation, you're disappointed, and you work harder and become better. So no paradox there.
Mm-hmm.
When we think about happiness, happiness has an emotional component, right? So as you highly value happiness and you encounter times when you fall short of this value, this expectation, you feel disappointed. That's an emotional state that's in direct conflict with the very goal that you have, which is happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's at the core of the paradox. And so we recently examined this value of happiness in greater detail. We used to think of it as a one-dimensional construct that's aligned along sort of strength of the value of happiness. But we noticed something, and others noticed that that might be too simplistic an idea, where the strength of the value itself might not be enough to engage these paradoxical effects. The reason for that being that you might have a really strong value of happiness, and you might fall short of your expectation, but you might handle that shortfall without stumbling on it. You might not react with greater disappointment, but just kind of like roll with it. And in cases like that, and we call this aspiring to happiness, it's people who sort of endorse happiness is extremely important to me, just that it could be pretty innocuous. But then there's the second case, and we call this being concerned about happiness. And this is a case, and we go back to beliefs and our own reactions to our own emotions. Here, you have people who worry, who are concerned when about their own level of happiness. And they believe that it means something negative about their lives, about how they're doing in the world, and they need to negatively elaborate on their own level of happiness by being disappointed, by judging their own experiences. And so it turns out when we look across 5 different samples, about 1,500 people, they reliably differ in terms of aspiring versus concern about happiness.
Mm-hmm.
People who are concerned about their own happiness, who react with negative elaboration to their own happiness levels, they go on to show the paradoxical effects. The more they value happiness in this concerned way, the less happy, the more depressed they go on to be. And then in a last part of the research, we wanted to look at this idea that this is because they respond with greater negative meta-emotion exactly when they ought to be happy, when they experience positive things in their daily lives. And we found that was the case. So when and we match sort of like the intensity of the positive events, like let's say a birthday party, people who are concerned about their own happiness undermine those experiences by injecting negativity, disappointment, and judgment into those experiences And over time, it feeds into exactly the thing that they want to avoid, which is less happiness and greater levels of depressive symptoms. So then the conclusion is that absolutely there are these paradoxes in focusing in the wrong way on our own happiness that we should try to avoid if we want to avoid the negative downstream consequences of those. And maybe it goes back to something that we talked about earlier, which is emotional acceptance. So in a way, be happy about what you have versus trying to have what you think you're going to be happy about might be the way to go.
But then these beliefs that people have about happiness, their expectations, and so on are also shaped by culture, right?
Yes. Yeah. So going back to the observation that at least anecdotally, some cultures seem to value happiness in a different way or think of happiness in a different way is borne out by some research. It's really complicated, as you know, comparing mean level reports across cultures is tricky because people in different cultures use scales in different ways and make judgments in different ways. There's something called a contrast group effect. So it's really hard to do that. One thing that we have tried to do to get around that is to examine the links between values, how people think about happiness and outcomes across different cultures. So in research that was done, led by Brett Ford, we compared US samples to Russian, German, and East Asian samples, and found that the cultures that valued happiness more in a socially engaged way did not show the paradoxical inverse relationship that I talked about earlier. So it's a little bit of a complicated design. I'll simplify. In the US, we saw that valuing happiness was less linked with socially engaged meanings of happiness, like spending time with other people, helping other people. In Germany, that link was absent. In Russia, the link started to flip. And then in East Asia, there's sort of like a gradient of interdependence, if you will. The link flipped more strongly. So in East Asia, valuing happiness was more strongly associated with socially engaged understandings of happiness. And to the extent that that was the case, valuing happiness was associated with greater benefits. So we see a flip of the relationship such that in East Asia, Japan and Taiwan, in this case, valuing happiness was associated with better outcomes. And that was explained by this more social focus.
So let me ask you then one final question. So at the very beginning of this section of our conversation on happiness, you mentioned that cross-culturally, at least as far as we know, it seems that everyone values happiness. At least, I mean, to a higher or lesser degree, it seems that everyone values happiness out there. So I would like to ask you, because there are people that pick on these results, like the ones that you mentioned there about the paradoxical effects of valuing and seeking happiness, and they tweak them and say that the conclusion then is that people should just ditch happiness, that happiness shouldn't matter, that people should seek other things in life. I mean, is that really warranted? I mean, does that conclusion follow from these results on the paradoxical effects of valuing and seeking happiness?
That's a really great question. To some degree, I want to say yes, it's warranted. And like, and that doesn't mean that that we should give up on happiness. But it's sort of one way to think about this is that there's better ways to actually go about achieving happiness. And those ways go via just focus on something else. So doesn't mean let's just be miserable and wallow in our misery, but rather let's take the focus away from happiness. And the cross-cultural research is sort of consistent with that. And so the idea being engage in things, sometimes these are called positive activities that will make you, that will have the downstream effect of making you happy. Interestingly, those might precisely be the more social things that I talked about. Being with other people, expressing gratitude, loving kindness meditations. Those are actually some of the most sort of proven ways of increasing well-being in a lasting way. The conclusion, I think, is absolutely founded that in a way, let's just ditch the direct focus on happiness. But ironically, happiness, as in the John Stuart Mill quote, might just appear as a side effect of focusing on these other pursuits and activities.
But perhaps I should have been a little bit more specific here, because I was talking about people who say that we should ditch happiness, but then to focus our efforts into, for example, grinding at our work and stuff like that. So perhaps that specifically is not so much of a good piece of advice, or is it?
No, I think that's a really bad piece of advice. And I would definitely not want the last word to be like, start grinding in your work.
Yeah.
I think but thank you for clarifying that. I
Yeah.
think that where I was coming from is that we should not ditch happiness as an ultimate and well-being as the
Yeah.
ultimate goal for many people, but we should ditch it as the direct thing that we're heading towards, right? But rather direct our attention towards some other things with the delightful side effect and the very much, to my mind, wanted side effect of that actually ultimately increasing happiness and well-being for people. So I don't think we want to ditch that as a goal. That's a little bit what I meant by like, should we all just like wallow in misery? Absolutely not. So as a goal, we don't want to abandon it, but we, I think, want to rethink about how we go about and how single-mindedly and how worriedly we go about pursuing it as a goal. Yeah.
Okay, great. So where can people find you and your work on the internet?
So probably the best place to look me up is at UC Berkeley, Emotion and Emotion Regulation Lab. And we're posting our work there and describe it. So that's probably the best place to find it. EERLAB, EERLAB.
Great. So I'm leaving links to it in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Mauss, thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been very fun to talk with you.
Thank you so much. It's been a delightful conversation.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fort, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.